Cancer is far more common than people realize. About 40% of us will be diagnosed with cancer at some point in our lifetime. And on one hand, a lot of the risk is just genetics and bad luck. But on the other hand, studies show that up to 40% of cancers in women and 57% of cancers in men may be preventable. Now, what does that mean? Well, you can't change your genetics, but you can influence how your genes behave. And one of the strongest levers you can pull to lower your risk of cancer is the foods that you eat or don't eat every day. Because cancer is not just a genetic disease, it's also a metabolic disease and an inflammatory disease. And in many ways, it's environmental. So the conditions inside your body matter, your hormones and your level of inflammation, and what kind of fuels your cells are exposed to. And this is the part that often gets missed. Even foods that seem normal or even healthy can push your body towards the exact conditions that cancer cells thrive in. So in this video, I want to walk you through specific foods that shape this internal environment. And I want to break down the science behind how they support or slow down cancer growth. And I'll give you a simple framework to help you shift things in the right direction. One that makes it much more difficult for cancer cells to take hold and grow in the first place. And along the way, we'll take a closer look at red meat and how you should approach it. These drinks deliver massive amounts of sugar into the bloodstream almost instantly. And we have large population studies that show that every additional 8-ounce drink of 100% fruit juice per day, so just one small glass, is associated with a 17% increase in breast cancer risk and a 10% increase in colorectal cancer risk and a whopping 30% increased risk in the cancers of the biliary tract. So that refers to cancers of the gallbladder and the bile ducts, the small tubes that connect the liver to the intestines. And sugary drinks have also been linked to cancer of the liver and the pancreas, oral cavity, and prostate. Now, these studies show associations, so not proof of causation. But if you look at what's happening biologically, this lines up pretty well. And it starts with something called the Warburg effect. These drinks deliver massive amounts of sugar into the bloodstream almost instantly. And we have large population studies that show that every additional 8-ounce drink of 100% fruit juice per day, so just one small glass, is associated with a 17% increase in breast cancer risk and a 10% increase in colorectal cancer risk and a whopping 30% increased risk in the cancers of the biliary tract. So that refers to cancers of the gallbladder and the bile ducts, the small tubes that connect the liver to the intestines. And sugary drinks have also been linked to cancer of the liver and the pancreas, oral cavity, and prostate. Now, these studies show associations, so not proof of causation. But if you look at what's happening biologically, this lines up pretty well. And it starts with something called the Warburg effect. So most healthy cells generate energy very efficiently. They use oxygen to slowly extract large amounts of energy from nutrients. But cancerous cells often behave very differently. Many of them switch to a faster metabolic pathway where they just burn through glucose extremely rapidly, even when there's oxygen available. And this process is called aerobic glycolysis. So think of it like an engine stuck at a full throttle. Cancer cells are constantly demanding fuel so they can divide and grow. And their preferred fuel is glucose. And there's another layer to this. When we consume large amounts of sugar, our body releases hormones like insulin and IGF-1. So these hormones regulate blood sugar, but they act as growth signals. They tell cells to grow and divide and store energy. And many cancer cells have far more insulin receptors than normal cells. In fact, some breast cancer cells actually have 6 to 10 times more insulin receptors than normal healthy cells, which means they respond much more strongly to insulin signaling. So when insulin levels remain chronically elevated, so we would call this hyperinsulinemia, the body is essentially bathing cells in growth signals. And if abnormal cells are present, well, those signals can accelerate their growth. This is why liquid sugar is especially concerning. It delivers large glucose loads without fiber, without satiety, and without slowing down absorption. So it's one of the fastest ways to push the body into that cancer-promoting metabolic environment. And there's also another issue that we have to worry about when it comes to sweet beverages, especially fruit juices, and that is inorganic arsenic exposure. So arsenic is classified as a group 1 carcinogen. It can damage DNA and it can disrupt gene regulation. And arsenic has been linked to lung cancer and bladder cancer and some skin cancers. And the American Cancer Society specifically lists fruit juice and especially apple juice among foods to avoid consuming excessively due to possible arsenic contamination. And other foods that we have to worry about when it comes to arsenic would be rice or rice products. So just from the arsenic contamination standpoint, white rice is usually lower in arsenic than brown rice. And there are simple ways to reduce exposure even further. One trick is to soak rice in water overnight and rinse it thoroughly before cooking. So if rice, especially white rice, is a regular part of your diet, those simple steps can meaningfully reduce that arsenic exposure. But sugary beverages are really just one part of a much larger pattern. And that pattern is the rise of ultra-processed foods. So these foods are heavily industrialized. They're made mostly from refined ingredients rather than whole foods. So this would be things like packaged snacks, fast food, processed desserts, most breakfast cereals, and many frozen meals. So these foods are engineered to be extremely palatable, which means they're designed to taste so good that it's hard to stop eating them. And they're also convenient and inexpensive. But they tend to drive the exact metabolic conditions that cancer cells thrive in. Large population studies show that for every 10% increase in ultra-processed food intake, your overall cancer risk goes up by 13%. And just look into the colorectal cancer, which is the fastest growing cancer in young people today. Their risk goes up by 30%. Now, again, this is association, not proof of causation, but the biology behind it makes sense because here's the problem. First, ultra-processed foods tend to drive rapid blood sugar spikes, which reinforces that insulin signal environment that we talked about earlier. And second, these foods promote chronic low-grade inflammation, and that can weaken your immune system, which is the first line defense that we have against abnormal cancer cells. And third, these foods can disrupt the gut microbiome. So many ultra-processed foods contain additives like emulsifiers that improve texture and they improve shelf life. But these compounds can damage the intestinal barrier and promote inflammation and worsening your gut health. And then we are running into the whole food displacement paradigm. The more ultra-processed foods that we eat, the less room there are for protective whole foods. So we end up getting less fiber and fewer phytochemicals and fewer vitamins and minerals, all of which are important for immune cells to function properly and to protect us against cancer. So the problem is not just one ingredient, it's the overall dietary environment. Now, another food category that we have to discuss is heavily salted or pickle foods. So certain preserved foods, especially those high in salt, have been linked to increased risk of stomach cancer. High salt concentrations can damage the lining of the stomach and they can promote chronic inflammation. And over time, that repeated irritation makes the stomach more vulnerable to cancer-promoting compounds. And we have studies that show that people with high salt intake have about a 68% higher risk of gastric cancer compared to people with lower intake. And then some of these preserved foods also contain compounds called nitrosamines, which are known to damage DNA. So this is one reason stomach cancer has historically been much more common in regions where salty or preserved foods are dietary staples, like in some parts of East Asia. Now, this next category is very controversial and it gets a lot of attention, and that is processed meat and red meat. And we have to approach this carefully because the science is not as black and white as some headlines make it seem. Many studies show a very strong association between higher intake of processed meats. So this would be things like bacon or sausage or hot dogs or deli meats and increased risk of colorectal cancer. In fact, the International Agency for Research on Cancer classifies processed meat as a Group 1 carcinogen. And the American Cancer Society guidelines report that each additional serving, or about 2 ounces of processed meat per day, increases the risk of developing colorectal cancer by about 23%. And processed meats have also been linked to higher risk of other cancers, including breast cancer and lung, esophagus, and prostate cancers. Now, before we go deeper into this, there's an important distinction that we have to make, because processed meat and red meat are often lumped together, but the data is very different for each one, and we should not approach them the same way. A recent review published last year pointed out that processed meats consistently show more harmful effects compared to unprocessed red meats. So that already tells us something important. It suggests that processing and preparation may matter just as much as the food itself. Now, when it comes to processed meats, the mechanisms are fairly clear. These foods often contain nitrites and nitrates, which are used for curing and preservation, and they add flavor. When these compounds enter the acidic environment of the stomach, they can form nitrosamines like NDMA, and these are known carcinogens that can damage DNA. And DNA damage is one of the first steps in cancer development. Now, with unprocessed red meat, the picture is more nuanced. There's still observational data that shows associations with certain cancers, especially colorectal cancer, but the link is weaker. That's why it's classified as a group 2A carcinogen, meaning there's limited direct human evidence, but strong biological plausibility. And this is where it gets controversial. A 2019 review published in the Annals of Internal Medicine concluded that reducing meat intake had only small effects with low certainty evidence and suggested that people continue the current intake. But the following year, the American Cancer Society actually responded to the paper. They pointed out that that review focused heavily on randomized controlled trials and placed less weight on observational studies. And this is where the debate really comes from, because nutritional research is not straightforward. So real quick, broadly, there are two main types of studies. There's randomized controlled trials, and then there's observational studies. With randomized controlled trials, you control what people eat and isolate just one variable. And that gives you stronger cause and effect data. But for cancer, this is very hard to do because cancer takes years, maybe even decades to develop. So you would need to control people's diets for 10, 20, even 30 years with perfect adherence. And realistically, that's just not possible. So this is where observational studies come in. They follow large groups of people over long periods of time, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people for decades. And then they look at patterns. For example, people who eat more red meat have higher rates of colorectal cancer. So the strength here is the scale and time, but the limitation is you can't control everything. So people who eat more red meat may also eat fewer vegetables or have different lifestyles. And researchers do try to adjust for this and account for these confounders, but they can't remove it completely. And another big weakness is a lot of nutritional research relies on food diaries, where people recall what they ate the previous day or last week. And those can get pretty inaccurate. So you're always balancing the two. Randomized controlled trials on one hand give you stronger cause and effect, but in shorter timelines and less realistic data that you may not be able to generalize to large populations. On the flip side, observational studies give you long-term real-world data, but more uncertainty and more bias. So this is why you see debates like this, because depending on how you weigh the evidence, you can come to very different conclusions. And with something as nuanced as cancer, we have to look at both types of studies and make the best prediction based on the totality of the available evidence. Is there a link between unprocessed red meat and cancer? Absolutely. But the way I see it, it's not just about the meat itself. It's also about what's missing from the diet. Because if you eat more of one thing, you often eat less of something else. And in many cases, that something else is fiber. And fiber is one of the strongest protective factors against colon cancer that we see across many studies, because fiber provides so many protective things at once. It regulates blood sugar and it feeds the beneficial gut bacteria. And those bacteria produce compounds like butyrate, which then reduce inflammation and support colon health. And there was an interesting study that highlights this. So this was published in the British Journal of Nutrition, where researchers had participants eat about 300 grams of red meat per day. And this increased the marker linked to DNA damage in the colon by 21%. But when they added 40 grams of resistant starch, which is a type of fiber, to the red meat, that increase in DNA damage markers completely disappeared. It just went back to baseline. And in the study, they used a resistant starch powder, but you can get it from whole foods like potatoes and legumes and green bananas. So what this suggests is the effect of red meat may depend heavily on your overall diet. If red meat is displacing fiber-rich foods, well, that creates one type of environment, an environment that may increase your risk of colorectal cancer or other cancers. But if red meat is combined with enough fiber or resistant starch, well, that environment can look very different. So my main takeaway is to have a nuanced approach and avoid extremes either way. If you're eating red meat every day, probably not a good idea. But red meat 1 or 2 times a week, I don't think there's enough evidence to say that will increase your risk of cancer, especially if you pair it with fiber-rich foods. Now, there is one more layer that often gets overlooked, and that is how the meat is cooked. When meat is grilled or fried or barbecued at very high temperatures, it can form very harmful compounds. So compounds like heterocyclic amines or polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And both of these compounds have been shown to damage DNA, which can then lead to cancer. So again, it's not just about what you eat, it's also how you prepare it. So you can reduce this by pre-cooking your meat before grilling to limit that time over high heat. And then you can use marinades with herbs and garlic and onions or vinegar, which has been shown to help limit the formation of these compounds. And it helps to avoid sugary marinades because those burn very quickly and increase the risk of charring. And another thing that can help is choosing leaner cuts of meat. Less fat means less dripping and less smoke, and fewer of those harmful compounds getting back onto the meat. All right, I hope this is helpful. Stay healthy, and I'll see you in the next one.